Hi everyone, I'm Rushank. I'm part of the Portkey team here. Do everything that we do on growth, developer success side of things. We have a bunch of people from Portkey, and then we also have some of Portkey users joining in. We're very excited to release this report today. We've been production partners for over 650 companies over the last 1.5 years. And because we pride ourselves on being the production stack for generative AI, we have seen some of the highest volume when it comes to LLM requests over our platform in the last 1.5 years. To the point where on Putki, we processed over 2 trillion tokens. These are the tokens that have gone to every single model that you can count. That is every model on OpenAI, Anthropic, Gemini, your Llama models hosted on any of the existing providers like Together AI, Fireworks AI, or even some of your hosted Llama models. And when we look back on at this data, we realize that it looks like we really have something special on our hands. On Putki, we have seen that there are companies that make over a million calls through our platform every day. And then the kind of concerns and questions that these companies have are very different from concerns that a developer who's just starting to adopt GenAI or who's just starting to make requests, they would have. So, if a developer is just starting out, they may have questions around, hey, what is the best LLM that I should choose? What is the best LLM that will help me do the job best? Or what's a good framework using which I can really take it the farthest possible. But when you take something to production, your questions change. When if you're getting a 1% error rate at a run rate of 1 million requests, that's what? That's 100,000 errors that you're getting. That's a lot. And if you're getting those many errors every day, then it's those 100,000 users who are going to face those problems. So what that essentially means is if you are in production, the concerns you have, the questions you have, they're very, very different. You may want to know, hey, if I'm sending requests to OpenAI, what is the best time when I should send the request? Should I send it when everybody in the US is sleeping so that I get better rate limits, so that I get lesser server rates? Or should I do something else? Should I really be using GPT-4o, or could I be using GPT-4o mini, which is much, much faster and which in many cases still ends up doing the same or better job? So, these are the kind of questions that you would have. And if you have been in the space for over a year, you would know that last year everybody was kind of just using the OpenAI models, but a lot has changed since now. So now so many companies are already trying out and adopting Anthropic's models. They're adopting Anthropic over using it on Vertex AI, over Bedrock, and over the Anthropic API itself. A lot of companies, a lot of enterprises specifically, are already going all in on the Google platform. So there are companies that have got all of their workloads on Vertex AI. So they are completely on Gemini models. What do those workloads look like? Are those APIs ready for production? So today in this webinar, I'm going to take you through some of these questions and the answers that we've got from analyzing 2 trillion of our tokens processed through all of these requests. Before that, I'll show you a poll that we ran about 2 days ago, and then we just asked a very simple question. What do you think is going to be the defining trend for enterprises in the year 2025? And there were four options. All four were, I would say, compelling. Would you see a lot of companies adopting multi-LLM strategy? So not just relying on OpenAI, but also calling other LLMs. Would you see Gemini starting to completely dominate GPT and Claude models, or that may not happen? Or would you think that costs for Gemini become a key concern? So far, people are trying out, people are in development, but when they go to production, do companies really get concerned about how much money they are spending per LLM and figure out ways to control it, or how would that work? And overwhelming majority of people voted for the first option, which is multi-LLM strategy. So I would kind of, maybe that's a teaser for what's inside the report, but the Potki report also kind of, I would say, agrees to that because on Potki we are also seeing that almost every enterprise that we talk to, they have got some multi-LLM strategy in place, also corroborated with the report, with the results. So let me take you through the report. As you can see, the core findings, I would say, from the last, all of these requests that we've been analyzing over the last year, there are four core key findings. One is last year, there were only about 23% enterprises that had any kind of calls going beyond OpenAI or beyond a singular LLM. That number from 23% has jumped to 40% in just the last 10 months. And we expect this trend to continue, which means that probably 6 months or 8 months down the line, you're going to see that over 60 to 70% of enterprises have got a multi-LLM strategy. A very interesting finding that we also saw was when this wave started and when companies were just starting to adopt GenAI, the kind of prompts that they were using, the kind of workloads that they had got, they were fairly simple, fairly straightforward. So, in terms of numbers, the average prompt size about a year ago for any request sent to any LLM was 500. So these are like maybe simple use cases. You're getting it to summarize something, or it's a one-shot use case where you just ask it to classify or do something, and then the LLM does it. A year down the line, the average prompt size has increased 4 times to 2000. You know, what does that mean? Maybe now people are stuffing a lot more context into their prompts. Maybe people are stuffing memory into the LLMs and then getting it to stick to whatever is the conversation that has been happening. Or maybe people are now have now realized that one shot doesn't really work or zero shot doesn't really work. Maybe you need to do few shot. So now companies have started to give a lot of examples to their LLM on how it should behave, and then the LLM does the job better. So I'll also tell you kind of, what's inside this number, but that number itself is fascinating. While a lot of companies have started to adopt multi-LLM strategy, OpenAI still hasn't like kind of, left its dominant position. It still has 53.8% market share when it comes to production AI. And this is, I would say, for good reason. So, I'll also take you through some of the performance insights that we've gathered, which point to why, even though there are maybe better models, faster models out there in the market, why do companies still go back to OpenAI as their dominant LLM? And lastly, the other key finding that we had was caching is something that we are seeing companies adopt at a very fast pace. And the reasons are very, very obvious. Caching on an average saves 38% in costs while improving response times by over 30 times. So these are the key findings. And now we're going to jump into our all of these insights that we've gathered, and we're going to drill down into them and see why, what kind of facts justify these numbers. So there are four things that we're going to cover. One is the adoption trends, what we're seeing in the market, what is the performance trend, what are the latency insights that we've gathered, and then some bits around cost and caching. Let's start. So this is the first big chart. It's interesting that while almost all the LLMs that we see, except for some of the DeepSeek ones or Mistral, almost all the LLMs are created by companies based in the US. So, of course, US having the dominant regional share when it comes to organization adopting GenAI, that's kind of justified. Surprising is India, which is close at 31 second, and then there's UK and the rest of Europe. So it's nice to see that US is still dominating, but we are also seeing that India and UK, they continuously keep increasing their market share when it comes to sending requests to production. And then within these countries, what does the market share look like in terms of what companies, what size are adopting GenAI? And again, here SMEs are dominating. SMEs, there are, of course, companies that are now tailor-built for GenAI workflows. But what's also even more surprising is the adoption rate for enterprises has been surprisingly fast. So, as you can see, enterprises are already almost 19% of all the GenAI in production requests, and we anticipate this to also continue. Okay, so some insights about countries, some insights about industries. Let's go into what what are companies adopting in terms of their core LLMs. And as I told you, OpenAI is at 53.8%. But interesting is Anthropic, which is already at 10.3%. And Google, which is even more surprising, which came out of nowhere last year, is already dominating 8% of the traffic. But this doesn't really tell you the whole story, right? So as you can see, OpenAI was much higher at the start of last year. It was almost 80 to 85%. And from there, it has started, gradually come down to now where it is at 53.8%. And this is month over month adoption rate. So what you're seeing is month over month, there are lesser companies now that are adopting sorry, OpenAI. And interestingly, Anthropic and Gemini, they are seeing a secular rising trend when it comes to month on month adoption. So Anthropic, they are seeing the highest MOM adoption rate. Anthropic is already at 61%, whereas Gemini is kind of close behind at 49%, and OpenAI is still growing, but not growing at the same rate that Anthropic and Gemini are growing. And then what does it look like in terms of cloud LLMs? So this is where it is even more surprising, right? So if I just go back and contrast, here when it comes to raw LLMs across any platform, it is Anthropic that's dominating, followed by Gemini. But when it comes to cloud adoption, it is so interesting that Vertex is growing almost 200% over, Bedrock and Azure OpenAI. So that's very exciting. And what's even more exciting is all of these things, right? So we've got these cloud that are operating at such high, fast, and growing percentages. And when it comes to token usage, how is that looking? So as I told you, right, we were seeing that earlier there were prompts with much lesser tokens that were dominating, and now we've got a mix of everything. But the trend is that we are seeing tokens prompts with higher tokens increasing in sizes. But it's still interesting that there is a drastic decline when it comes to prompts using lesser tokens. And I would attribute that to some of the exciting new techniques that we saw mid last year. So these are techniques like React or chain of thought, which started gaining prominence. And then we started seeing companies rapidly adopting these new techniques to make their LLMs work better. And then there is a question that I asked, right? What are the timings where companies end up spending most of their requests? And again, this trend is also very, very surprising. So as you can see, of course, during the night time, there are lesser number of requests, but as the day rises, you see that companies start to make much more requests. And then, of course, this differs significantly across different regions, but it's still interesting to see that uh, you know companies are almost always doing something that is live in production where there is a direct feedback from customers. It is only very recently that we are seeing adoption for batch inference API also pick up. Now, it's not just OpenAI that has got its batch API, right? So there is Bedrock. Bedrock also exposes the batch API. Anthropic also recently released their batch API. So we are seeing that for workloads that do not require immediate response from the user. So something like when you have to embed a document, or something like maybe you got a nice enough long task, maybe like content summarization or call transcript summary, some things where you do not immediately require to send an output to the user. We are seeing companies adopt batch API very significantly for those kind of use cases. To to the point where on Putki, we've now also deployed a universal API just for batch inference APIs. So if you are using Putki, you could not only be calling OpenAI for your batch workloads, you could also be calling Anthropic, you could be calling Bedrock, you could be calling Fireworks AI for running your batch inference workloads. So that's very interesting. So these are some of the insights that we've gathered around how the adoption trend across providers is looking, what are the kind of token trends we are seeing, what are the timings where companies are making requests. But when it comes to in production stuff, all of this is just it's just a primer. The real meat is in really what's going on with the actual responses that you get from the LLMs. And this is because at Portkey, we see that there are so many requests that fail when it comes to LLM workloads for no reason. So essentially, LLMs are not production ready APIs because the error rates that you see here are something that you'll typically not see in a production API. I'll tell you what I mean by that. So, as I say here, it's not just about speed, it's about what is the consistent request rate that you get, how do you see companies handling failures, what happens when OpenAI is down, and does your app also go down, or are you able to do something about it? And this is kind of what it says. It If you were to look at what are the providers where you get the highest number of server error rates. So server error rates are typically error rates that you can't really explain. These are kind of inexplicable errors. Maybe you're getting a 502 or you're getting a 529 error, and maybe you are just trying to hit the API again and again, and nothing is working. You're not getting rate limited. You're not just, getting throttled. It's something else. So this is what it is. And especially for LLM workloads, the number of server error rates that you get are amazingly high. So Grok, for every request that you make, 0.67% requests just get a flat server error rate. Interestingly, that number is also high for Anthropic, where Anthropic closely followed by Grok, you see 0.58% of server error rates. There's next is Perplexity, and then there's also Deep Infra. So Deep Infra is where you will also access models like DeepSeek. And the interesting thing that I would take away from this chart is OpenAI is almost at the very end. So if you go back and we look at the first slide where it says that OpenAI has 53.8% market share, it's justified because OpenAI happens to be one of the most stable platforms in terms of server errors. But also, of course, this is not the whole story. In the LLM world, the GPUs are really, really, scarce. Well, not so anymore now, but for the longest, it has been the case. And for a platform like Grok, which has such high response rates, so many companies want to adopt it. Grok is severely limited by the number of rate limits that you get, to the point where Grok's rate limit errors on an average request are above 20%. Maybe you would like to use Grok because it is so fast, but you would want to use it with fallback to some other provider because you cannot have every fifth request of yours just getting rate limited. You would never be able to scale your workload. Grok, interestingly, is closely followed by Perplexity, where in production, rate limit error is over 10%. Then there's Anthropic, which is very surprising given the 9% market share that it already has. So, maybe Anthropic has gotten something going for it while it has high server errors, while it has high rate limit errors, etc. And of course, it is OpenAI that is still very, very less here. OpenAI is somewhere close to less than 1%, I think 0.2 or 0.3% of all of its all of its requests get rate limited. And let's dive deep into it further, right? Okay, so you've got your request. Maybe you look at all of this data and you figure out, okay, I'll just, have what everybody else is having, and I'll go with OpenAI. OpenAI doesn't get as many server error rates. OpenAI doesn't get as many rate limit errors. But I also have two choices to pick from when I want to pick OpenAI. Should I directly go for the OpenAI API or should I go for Azure OpenAI? And my general assumption as an enterprise might be that Azure OpenAI is going to be more reliable because, I would get to provision the Azure OpenAI instance myself. It's a cloud and they are trying to give you much stringent SLAs. So probably Azure OpenAI works better. You would think. But let's look at what happens when we analyze our data on Portkey, where we send significantly high number of requests across both OpenAI and Azure OpenAI. And so what we did was you cannot really compare apples to oranges, right? So we said, okay, let's take the model GPT-4o. Let's see how was the trend looking for GPT-4o over the last 6 months. across both OpenAI and Azure OpenAI, and you have the results in front of you. For GPT-4o model, across both OpenAI and Azure OpenAI, you can see that it is Azure OpenAI that typically has more fluctuations when it comes to server error rates. Of course, OpenAI had a abnormally high peak last month when, they faced significant server downtime. So maybe that changes things for a bit, but it is Azure OpenAI that has typically been uh, very, very fluctuating. And kind of the same pattern also repeats for rate limit errors. So you would think that maybe when you get your Azure OpenAI instance provision, you're not going to face rate limits, but the data suggests that that's not going to be the case. Even on your Azure OpenAI request, you would still get a bunch of rate limit errors, and 429s is something that you'll just consistently keep seeing. OpenAI also, of course, gets rate limit errors, but not at the rate where Azure OpenAI gets. So where does that leave you, right? If you have decided that you want to use OpenAI, would you want to use just OpenAI? Or would you just want to use Azure OpenAI? Maybe what would you choose? So our recommendation at Portkey would be that maybe, OpenAI is something that's much less fluctuating compared to Azure OpenAI, but OpenAI does see some of its bad moments, and you don't want to be, left, just with empty hands when something like that happens. So what we would suggest is maybe have OpenAI as your primary provider or have Azure OpenAI as your primary provider, given that you've decided to shift all of your workloads onto a specific model like GPT-4o or GPT-4o mini, or maybe even Owen mini. But once you do that, make sure that you use maybe something like Portkey or any other platform to set up a fallback. So you can say something like, hey, I want to send my request first to the GPT-4o model on OpenAI, but for whatever reason OpenAI is down or I get rate limited from OpenAI, automatically send my request to GPT-4o on Azure OpenAI. And we say that every company that does that almost completely eliminates all of these errors or fluctuations that you see. And that's kind of expected because our OpenAI and Azure OpenAI, they work completely separately. So when there is going to be a downtime on OpenAI, that doesn't get commuted back to Azure OpenAI. When Azure OpenAI is facing GPU crunch or rate limits, etc., that doesn't get commuted back to OpenAI. So by having a multi-provider strategy, you you figure out ways to completely eliminate all of these error scenarios for your workloads. That's the story for OpenAI. What's the story for Anthropic? Now you saw that Anthropic is quickly gaining market share. Month on month, it's gaining 60% market share, whereas OpenAI is growing significantly lesser. But of course, the truth is for Anthropic also, Anthropic sees significant server error rates, sees significant rate limit errors. The nice thing about Anthropic though is Anthropic is available not just on the Anthropic API, but also across two cloud providers compared to OpenAI's one. So Anthropic is available not just over Bedrock, but also over Vertex AI. So, you could be hitting the Anthropic API for the Claude Sonnet 3.5 model. You could also be hitting AWS Bedrock. You could also be hitting Vertex AI. And, it's the same model across all of these three cloud providers. You'd get ideally the same response back. And that leaves you with an interesting question. Okay, maybe not just OpenAI, I could also shift some of my workloads to Claude because I see that, I get to have two steps of redundancies. So we also analyze some of that data for you. Here's what it shows. Let's see, right? So if you got your request on Anthropic directly for Sonnet 3.5 model, you see that there's some amount of rate limit errors that you should expect, to the point where for the Claude Sonnet 3.5 model, you can expect rate limit errors as high as 15%. Interestingly, that's not the case with Bedrock. Bedrock does get some amount of rate limit errors, but that number is significantly lesser than Anthropic. Let's look at what happens for server error rates. So server error, I think it just made a typo here. This is a 500 error. But what it says is broadly the same story. But here, kind of both the platforms are at the same error rate. Anthropic also gets up to 15% of its requests that gets server error rates, and similar is the case for Bedrock. Bedrock also gets often 15 or 20% server error rates. So essentially, what that means is you want to ensure that this doesn't happen to you. So if you got your workloads on cloud, you want to be able to not just use Bedrock, but you also want to put your leg on Vertex AI and be able to switch between all of these three different providers for any of your workloads. So, this was the number that I was showing you as part of the pool. We are seeing multi-provider adoption also pick up at a secular pace on Portkey. So that was some of the performance insights that we saw. Now, okay, you got performance, but once you kind of fix that, you want to ensure that once you get it working, you also make it fast. How do these providers fare when it comes to making things speedy? Everybody knows that Grok is fast, but we also saw that Grok is not reliable. You can have rate limit errors as high as 25%. So let's go back to the tried and tested models across OpenAI, etc., and let's see what is the response time trends looking for that. Again, we've taken a slice of all of the requests that we have on Portkey just to analyze how does it look for the GPT-4o model. And what we try to do is, if you were to make a decision now between having OpenAI or Azure OpenAI as your primary provider, what should you really go with? You decided that you want to go with both of these providers. But what is the first one that will ensure that I get the response at the fastest time? Interestingly, here there's not much difference between the two providers. As you can see, the average latency for a request made to OpenAI is about 3 seconds, whereas for Azure it is 5 seconds. But that's the P50 latency. What happens when you take it to P95 for somewhat unpredictable workloads or in production workloads that you're going to see? There, Azure, while it had a high variance about 6 months ago, they seem to have made improvements. It has come around to almost the trends that you see for OpenAI. So that's the nice thing. It would not matter if you pick OpenAI or Azure OpenAI, you would be getting the same response times. What does it look like for Claude now? And in contrast to the previous chart, this is interesting. On Claude, you see that again, I think we just made a typo. We'll have to fix this. But on Claude, what you see is Bedrock is significantly more fluctuating when it comes to response times. But the nice thing is over the last 2 months, of course, it has been stable, as you can see here. But if you also look at the trend line, you see that Bedrock started at a very rocky place about 6 months ago, which is when they had actually launched the cloud models on Bedrock. And over the last 6 months, it has consistently come down. It has also started to get much more reliable. So again, if you were using Bedrock, I would suggest that, come back to Portkey to look at what this month's data says, what you see for what we are seeing for January in terms of latency trends on Bedrock. And then along with the Portkey team, you could decide if you could have, it would not matter to you whether you had your primary model on Anthropic or on Bedrock. So those are some of the trends that we have seen across OpenAI Anthropic models, across provider trends, and what do the numbers say when it comes to latency trends, when it comes to server rates, the rate limit errors, etc. This leaves the question open for costs. Of course, everybody knows that costs have significantly kept coming down, but what you also saw was as the costs come down, the consumption actually increases. So while earlier people were making very, very small prompts and they were getting their work just with those, then the prompt size has increased 4 times in the last year. And the cost, has it increased 10 times, 4 times in the last year? For some models, it has. For some models, it has not. What do you do as the prompt size keeps increasing, which is going to be the trend, right? You're going to want to put more context every provider that you see is increasing the token window significantly. So OpenAI, when it launched, it had 4K as part of its token input window. Then it went it up took it up to 16K. Then it took it up to 32K. Now it is at 128K. Of course, Gemini is a whole different story. Gemini models already have 1 million in terms of token window. Similarly, for Anthropic, it's already at, I think, what, 256K, and this trend will continue. So, which means that you will also keep stuffing your prompts with much more context. So, what that means is you're still going to need to figure out a very resilient and sound costing strategy. At Portkey, what we recommend you do is you implement a caching limit for all of your requests. As you start to onboard more users, as some of your workloads start to repeat, you're seeing that, if you served something for one user previously, it's entirely possible that for a new user, you might end up seeing the exact same workflow again. Maybe somebody wants to, uh, you know, ask questions on the same document that somebody else had asked, or somebody wants to do some kind of a content summary task that somebody else within the org has already done. So many such use cases. In such use cases, if you have got a caching layer running for all of your LLM requests, what it means is before you send the request to the LLM, you're going to hit the cache and see if maybe serve the same request again. If you have, you just, save considerable amount on not just cost, but also on response times, because you're not now waiting on the LLM to run its whole inference and get you back the answer. On Portkey, we are already seeing a lot of companies adopt caching, and then the numbers are staggering. We are seeing that there's a 36% hit rate for cache for specifically Q&A scenarios. So you've got a customer support bot or you've got a regular Q&A bot for your product, you're going to see that anywhere between 20 to 40% of all of your requests are just going to be repeat requests that can just be eliminated by sending and serving from the cache. Every time you do that, you serve the response 30 times faster. That's a huge, addition to user delight. And so, you just go for it. But of course, not just that you get the responses faster, you also end up saving over 40% just in your LLM bills month over month. So that's about it.